My dear friends and family, in our previous episode we talked about the top 5 most ancient Russian weapons and vehicles used by the so-called World's Second Army in their invasion of Ukraine. You may want to check it out. And while it was already cringy by itself, I decided not to stop there and make my personal rating of top 5 cringiest and most ridiculous Russian military innovations that were spotted in Ukraine and often improved right there using Ukrainian attack drones and javelins. Without further ado, let's get into it. Number 5 in my rating, of course, goes to the famous Russian cope cages, or as I like to call them, combat-grade barbecue grills for orcs. These metal contemporary art installations first appeared on Russian tanks as early as in 2022, shortly after their military geniuses realized that Ukrainian soldiers have javelins and NLAWs, and they are not shy about using them. These cages were supposed to protect the terror Russian tanks from top attack missiles. We're talking about the missiles that fly up and then rain down on Russians like karma. The problem is those cages were about as effective as using a tinfoil hat against a HIMARS strike. According to open source intelligence and literally every destroyed Russian tank visible on satellite images, these cages did nothing except make the tanks taller, clumsier, and somehow even uglier, like if you took a Russian tank and gave it a bad haircut in prison. In fact, the cope cages became such a meme that even Russians themselves started calling them mangal, which means grill. Because apparently if you cannot avoid the missile hitting you, at least you can cook shashlik over your burning tank wreck afterward, if you survived, of course. And mighty Russian propaganda tried to spin it like this was an innovative battlefield adaptation. Next thing you know, they will be duct taping wooden planks to their vehicles and calling it strategic bio-armor. However, I think they actually did it. As a summary, Russian cope cages were a shining example of Russia's military doctrine. It's when you don't have solutions, improvise some steel bars and pray. And as we Ukrainians say, pray really hard because the javelins and FPVs are coming. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the second position of my rating, occupied by a brilliant wonder of Russian military engineering, the turtle tank. These magnificent disasters first crawled into the spotlight in 2024 during Russia's glorious attempt to lose even more tanks around Avdiivka. Now, what is a turtle tank? Imagine you take a regular outdated T-72 or T-62, which is already a piece of rolling Soviet scrap metal, and you weld a freaking barn over it. According to Russian logic, this DIY steel shell would protect the tank from a Ukrainian FPV drone. The all-seeing experts, including those at Oryx, documented multiple tanks getting destroyed by, you guessed it, FPV drones, artillery, and Ukrainian soldiers. It turned out that slapping a 2-ton metal barn on top of your tank doesn't make it invincible. It just makes you a bigger and, of course, much slower target. Also makes you look completely ridiculous and, what was the word? Very Russian, so to say. The turtle tank, my friends, another proof that when Russian army runs out of ideas and vehicles, they reach deep into their vodka-fueled imagination and come up with something that would make even Mad Max say, "Bro, that is too much." Number 3. Nothing says mighty Russian army like a bunch of invaders riding Chinese motorcycles and mopeds over the Ukrainian minefield. Because when your glorious second army of the world starts looking like a Mad Max cosplay convention, you know things are going according to the Kremlin's 5-year plan for embarrassment. Starting in 2023, Russian forces, especially in Donbass and Zaporizhia area, started fielding Chinese-made dirt bikes as well as Soviet motorcycles and even mopeds for rapid assault operations. They called them mobile assault groups. I call them donor delivery services. I'm sorry, we love dark humor. The Russian so-called military bikers were supposed to be fast, nimble, hard to hit, but in practice they were about as effective as a drunk Russian bear on a scooter. Videos from Ukrainian units show orcs driving these budget bikes into open field only to get instantly smoked by FPV drones, toasted by artillery, or sometimes even just a dude with an AK and good aim. Which apparently explains why Russian motorcycle gangs have the smallest lifespan comparing to their American rivals. The fact is, some Ukrainian soldiers nicknamed them meat cycles, because when your army is using Chinese motorbikes and the majority of your APCs are being destroyed, maybe it's time to admit that you're not fighting the World War III, you're fighting for the Darwin Award. But on the other hand, you know, I gotta give them credit for creativity, because next step probably we will see something like pogo sticks or shopping carts, maybe even skateboards. Please let me know in the comments what they may come up with next, because we gotta prepare. Fourth position of my today's rating serves as a confirmation that the Russian invaders have officially reached peak humiliation. I'm talking about deploying Chinese-made golf carts on the battlefield. Because when your logistics system collapses harder than your propaganda and your armored personnel carriers burn faster than you can produce, you have absolutely no other choice but to address Chinese Golf Association. The golf carts from China started popping up in 2024 around the Donetsk and Zaporizhia Oblast. Russian units that were desperate for mobility began using cheap Chinese golf carts, some modified with metal plates and others left gloriously open. As of today, it was estimated that the Russian terrorists in Ukraine have already lost almost 23,000 armored personnel carriers and almost 49,000 combat vehicles and trucks, which makes it vast majority of all the combat vehicles produced over the years by the Soviet Union. And as you can probably tell, Russia can only produce a tiny fraction of that. What else can I say? Open source analysts spotted several models: the famous Desert Cross 1000, the 3-seater, and the Joiner Trooper UTV. Retail price around $15,000 each, battlefield lifespan about as long as it takes a Ukrainian FPV drone to say "Zdorovenki bully." And what was the greatest tactical theory behind this? Well, the Russians figured if they cannot afford proper armored vehicles, because, you know, sanctions, corruption and massive losses, then they can at least send their cannon fodder into traditional Russian meat assaults in what is basically an armored lawnmower with ambitions. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Footage from Ukrainian drone units shows these things getting obliterated in glorious 4K. Sometimes they explode, sometimes they flip over, sometimes they just stall in the mud like they forgot that they are not on a golf course anymore. Russian Telegram channels tried to justify this, of course, by calling it high mobility assault tactics, and of course, next thing you know, they will be attacking us on segways and calling it new generation warfare. Time to talk about the winner of today's rating, my friends. Latest military innovation used by the mighty Russian army, the second best army in Ukraine. I'm talking about the most recent breakthrough in Russian military logistics, the noble donkeys, and of course horses, because when your modern armored columns are spontaneously combust under HIMARS fire, you go back to the classics. Reports from Ukrainian intelligence, as well as TikTok videos from the Russian terrorists themselves, show that Russian forces in certain areas are actually resorting to horses and donkeys to transport ammunition and supplies. That's right, my friends, the army that promised to capture Kyiv in 3 days is now reenacting a budget version of Red Dead Redemption. In Luhansk Oblast, for example, Ukrainian General Staff reported already in the late 2023 that Russian units were using pack animals. They used them in difficult terrains to bypass destroyed bridges and impassable mud. Because apparently if you lose 72,000 transport vehicles in Ukraine in just 3 years, logistics become kinda tricky. But on the other hand, my friends, you know, horses and donkeys don't require diesel. They just need grass, some love, and probably occasionally some vodka if they want to feel truly integrated into the so-called Russian military culture. In the end, my friends, it's 2025 and the Kremlin is fighting a 21st century war utilizing 19th century logistics. Next step, I don't know, Kazaki with sabers, or masters of Russian counterclass combat with an Orthodox cross. The biggest irony is that all sorts of paid pro-Russian talking heads even today keep repeating that Ukraine is fighting until the last Ukrainian and running out of weapons. In the meantime, Ukraine produces advanced drones, Ukraine even exports those drones. Also, Ukraine receives NATO fighter jets and plans establishing a 50-kilometer dead zone along the front line using modern technologies and AI. And the Russian invaders lost so much stuff in just 3 years, so now they have to use donkeys and golf carts. Who could imagine this in 2022? I literally had absolutely no idea. But I can tell you one thing for sure. Russian army, though it's definitely a threat, but also it's a real circus. And the Russian invaders will go down in history as clowns, looters and criminals. And this is something absolutely no Russian propagandist will ever change. Dear friends, let me know if you liked this episode, and as always, I will see you in the comments. I'm Operator Starsky. Thanks for watching.